criminological theory course about that. And when I met you in Bangkok, when we did the Peace Fellowship, I had been working for a while already then. That was, gosh, 6 years ago now, 7 years almost. And I had already been working for probably 6 or 7 years on looking at the police use of deadly force, which has been well known and understood in the Black community here, but wasn't broadly considered. And I was shocked at first to realize there's no official statistics kept on that data here in the States. The biggest power the state has to take a life, and they don't keep data. Other countries, like the UK, I remember meeting someone from the UK, they could pull the phone out of the pocket and find out exactly how often that's happened, when, where. If you're a police officer killed in the line of duty, they keep about 152 data points on each incident, in a data file by the FBI, I believe, or some federal entity. And so I was at first very surprised, but then when you started to think about it, you're like, oh, this is one of those intentional oversights. Like, you could have this data if you wanted, but you're not having it for a reason because you don't want to acknowledge what's happening. And clearly, as it's become more of a bigger story in the broader zeitgeist, it's been happening, and it's always been happening for a long time. The policing in the US was designed initially as a means of tracking down runaway slaves. So it's always been a racialized system. And so when I first met you and first heard about what you were doing, literally like the second or third day of certainly the first week of Peace Camp, as I call it, I was like, oh my God, what an amazing tool. And to me, it was a no-brainer. Like this, just like with gender violence, as it gets at a behavior or criminal engagement that is not consistently recorded. We know that there's lots of cases that we never hear about, that are never reported. Same thing with this. And so the idea that, you could put the hands, put this in the hands of the people, and the people could show exactly what's happening. There are entities that now have maps of deaths by police, but police use of force, which I guarantee happens, as the George Floyd case illustrated. The officer that killed George Floyd had injured like 60 people. There had been altercation after altercation before that. And, that's great that he was held accountable. But what about the department that licensed him and gave him a badge and left him on the streets to continue to do that over and over? Because before there's a death, I guarantee you that there's been a lot of incidents like that. And we need a means to see that. And so that was, when I met you, the first thing that came to my mind, and I've since become much more engaged in the gender realm. And there's just such an intersection. I ran a discussion earlier this week with my course that's engaging, the local ecology of youth is what we're calling it. And it was very interesting. One of the students observed in the discussion we had with them, they talked way more about gender violence, especially by adults in schools, than they did anything else. And there's no, reporting of that. So we deploy this for gender, and it can pivot to race, ethnicity, any kind of thing we can put on that same map. And that just makes a lot of sense. I have a student looking at Jewish violence. I had no idea. Right here in DC, there's people that have trouble going to synagogue because children are getting harassed and attacked because they're vulnerable. And the attackers know that, for Orthodox Jews on the Sabbath, when they're traveling, they don't carry a phone. They're not engaged with technology. And so they're completely vulnerable. And, this is a tool. There's a tool in the community, but the more we intersect the maps, the more effective, I think. I get excited about the topic. So I'll stop now. But yes, that is what came to mind. And we are now working on deploying this around racial violence, policing in particular in, DC, in a neighborhood. So, but I'll save that for later.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne, for that overview. So for those who've come in, as we started, my name is Elsa Marie De Silva, and I'm the founder of Red Dot Foundation. And I launched Safecity along with some colleagues after a horrific gang rape of Jyoti Singh on a bus in Delhi. Prior to that, I used to work in the aviation sector, and I was constantly using data. But, when we had this incident that took place in December of 2012, it opened up the conversation in the public realm about sexual violence, which is a highly taboo topic. And I myself was reminded of my own memories of incidents that I had experienced but never reported. And therefore, there is a data gap that exists. And through the crowd map, that is a crowdsourcing tool where you can anonymously share your stories. It's logged by location, date, time of day, and category of incident with some ability to write a greater detail of what has happened. And that information really helps to bridge the data gap, but also inform individuals, inform communities, so that they can then design interventions. And one of the first people who recognized how this tool was useful, because I didn't come from the women's movement, nor did I come from a gender studies background. I was just trying to be useful and trying to do the best to respond to a particular situation. So one of the people who recognized the potential was actually Jane Anyango. She is a member of the Vital Voices Network, which I'm part of. And we met in 2014. And I was explaining to this group of women, international women working on violence against women and girls, about this tool. And she said, Elsa, can we partner and collaborate? And so that's how this collaboration was born. So Jane, can you share a little bit about your work in Kibera? And can you share about how collecting data is critical to understanding the nature of violence?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elsa. My name is Jane Anyango, as you have heard. I'm the founding director of Polycom Development Project, an organization working with women and girls in Kibera slums in Nairobi. Kibera is the biggest slum in sub-Saharan Africa. So I met Elsa in 2014 during a tour in Kuala Lumpur. No, that was in
It was in Nepal.
Nepal, yes, in Nepal. And when she made her presentation, I was like, this is something that I have to take back home. So initially we had been collecting a lot of information from the children, but we didn't know what to do with the information through a platform we call the talking boxes. So we would install boxes, locked up boxes in schools, and encourage the children to write whatever they want to write and put inside the boxes. So we would collect the contents and organize forums for these girls based on the issues that they were raising. And that is how it ended. We didn't know what to do with these contents. We would just throw them away. So when I listened to Elsa, how the data is collected and put together and even put on a platform, then I thought that this is something that we should really get ourselves into. So we were able to bring Elsa to Nairobi, and she trained our people on data collection. In fact, we brought our staff from Red Dot Foundation, and then Elsa also came. And what is interesting about what we learned from Safecity is that it doesn't just end with the children, it brings other stakeholders on board also to just get that collective ideas on how to solve the problems. So we have been collecting data, and we collect data every day. I know at times I'm not able to share much with Elsa, but the truth is we just picked this idea and we're running with it. Early this year, we were able to come up with a policy evidence report on sexual harassment. And this is just from the data that we had collected. So we put the data together into a report. Years back, there's a bill that was shot down in Parliament that was proposing a strong conviction for people who, for perpetrators of sexual harassment, but it was shot down because it didn't have any evidence. And now this policy evidence report has brought a lot of conversations and even redefinition of sexual harassment in Kenyan law, because in Kenyan law, they only recognize sexual harassment in work setup, but not in informal spaces like public spaces or even in schools. So we have really been able to collect a lot of data. Like right now, we are tomorrow, actually, we are having a forum with over 100 teachers. And the reason why we are having this is that we have had so many girls reporting cases of sexual harassment. Initially, before I met Elsa, these things of ogling, commenting, touching were not, to me, they were not really things that people would take seriously. And I think the fact that we were able to pick the graphical representation of different forms of sexual harassment and share with the children are now coming out to say anytime they see any red flag, they are able to come out and talk. And as a result of that, we're going to have a meeting with all the teachers in all our partner schools. There are more than 700, but it starts tomorrow with the teachers. We call them patrons. That is the lead teachers in the schools that we are working with and the principals of the school. And we've been able to bring people from the education sector and a few civil society organizations together so that we talk about the contents that we have been able to get through crowd data sourcing. So I'm really excited about this. We have been able to share this at during the World Urban Forum that is in Kuala Lumpur. During Urban Thinkers campuses, this is what we have shared as the best practice where you get everyone to be responsible in seeing what happens to them and reporting. So we still don't really have, we are not digital enough to get people with the telephone in the slums, but we still use the papers and collect the data and put together and try to make something reasonable out of it. I know we are still going to continue with the conversation. Otherwise, I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. And crowd data sourcing is something that we are not stopping. We are going on with it. Thank you so much.
Jane is such a powerhouse, and what she's describing is so common, and that's what I've learned is in the last 9 years that a lot of women do not, and men do not actually understand the spectrum of abuse. And when we start to collect this data and start categorizing them, many people have said that we have given a vocabulary to their experience. Often, in the newspapers, we only read about rape, but on a daily basis, we are experiencing various other forms of assault, which may be considered too trivial. They are normalized on a daily basis, and therefore, the burden to stay silent is on the victim or survivor. So by crowd mapping, you're actually making visible all these incidents which never make it to the official authorities, and it indirectly puts pressure on them to behave and to do their job. Because in India, unlike in maybe Kenya and other countries, in India, we do have laws. We do have laws on sexual harassment in public spaces, in private spaces. But unfortunately, it's implementation of the law that is poor. And people also are not aware of their rights. So there's a lot of advocacy that we do around the data, but also on the spectrum of abuse and the various laws. But I want to turn to Monica, because we are talking about, different forms of violence, and domestic violence is one of the biggest forms of violence. And that is unique because it's in a private space, most often by a loved one. It's harder to report, it's harder to ask for help, and even the intervention is different. So can you share a little bit about your work, Monica? And also, first share a little bit about your work, and maybe in the second round, we'll talk about the recent spurt in racial violence against the Asian American community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Elsa. It's an honor to be with you all today. My background, Elsa had mentioned that I'm a lawyer. I went to law school to learn and advocate against gender-based violence growing up and seeing it in my community. My aunt was a victim of domestic violence. So it's very important to me, and it fueled why I went to law school. And when I was, when I finally graduated, I worked in the immigrant rights field. And there was a common theme of communities, sometimes knowing about gender-based violence happening, within their own population. Some wanted to do something about it, others were, a little more hesitant. And that theme really just, was really apparent to me. And so the work that I've done for, 20 plus years has been representing immigrant victims of domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual assault. And, now just recently, earlier this year, I left, the immigrant rights field and am now focusing more on the Asian Pacific Islander community. And there's been so many things that I've learned, with gender-based violence. I'm the executive director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and really narrowing my focus to the AAPI community. I've learned so much, Number one, and these are things that I think we all know, but it's really important to say it out loud. The Asian Pacific, Islander community is really vast, right? It's almost half the population of the world. And you can't use the same approach for, advocating against gender-based violence in the, Chinese, population as you would with the Samoan population. And even though we're a resource center that works with, all countries that fall under the diaspora, we ourselves have to continually remind ourselves. And that's where the data is really important, because if we just lump everyone under AAPI, then you're losing the nuances of what may happen in the Samoan, community versus another community. And, we're also responding with not the right information if we're talking to law enforcement systems, and if we don't make those distinctions, I think just throwing everyone under that same population can be quite harmful. And also, so one project that I would love to, talk about for 30 seconds is my organization, before I joined, had this power and control wheel for the AAPI community, which really just represented how gender-based violence looks in our community overall. But when we took it to the Samoan population, they said, this is not really representative of what we go through, and we need to change it. And we need to really get in deeper within family violence, and show how family violence can fuel some of the gender-based violence, and so we had to really take that wheel and make it into a spiral for for another population to really reflect what's happening there. And our goal is now to do that with other communities as well, because we've learned in just that exercise and having listening sessions that we're not doing the population justice by lumping everyone together. There's this one statistic that we talk about, which is, 18 to 55% of, women in the AAPI community have experienced sexual violence. Well, that's so vast. What are we really saying with that statistic? And it's actually quoted in a book that Sue Ann Hong wrote about, racial violence in the AAPI community. And that's something that, shows us that we really need this data that Elsa and others on the panel have been talking about to really reflect the problem that we're seeing and the challenges.
Thank you, Monica. And it's really important because I personally have seen that at least in the India data set, where we have the largest number of reports, what is being reported in Delhi is very different from what's being reported in Mumbai, for example. The trends are different. Within a city, the trends are different. So that means it is very important to understand the context, the intersectionality, and also deep dive into the contributing factors of the violence. And I look at crowd mapping such violence as a starting point for such dialogue. And now I want to bring in Andrea, who is a professor at UDC and is an ethicist. So Andrea, you've been looking at our data, and we've been writing research papers on various themes around our data. What have you noticed about this crowd mapping methodology, and why is it so powerful?
So thank you, Elsa, for having me on, and what an exciting panel. Just listening to what Monica was saying about the different communities. One of the things that's really important about how Safe City is approached within communities is the fact that it recognizes the vulnerability of the population that's there. A lot of times when we're talking about vulnerable populations, we kind of lump them all together as well. And because the Safe City deployment model actually goes into communities and begins to talk to them about what's important to them, this is the same thing that Jane had said and Monica has said about how Safe City is deployed. And so as an ethicist, we wanted to look at ethics as the starting point for how communities are dealt with, not just in terms of what's in the app, but in terms of how the communities are brought together to actually develop the information that becomes that evidence that we've been talking about. And so it starts out with, like I said, an ethical standard, making sure that the app is even translated into different languages, things like that, that actually pull the information in and make it real to the individuals who are using the app. But what we've started to do is we've looked at the research methodology and how we're bringing this together. And communicative methodology research actually takes the individuals that are actually being studied and allows them to participate in the study itself and to develop not only the interventions that they come up with, but to see the barriers in a particular light. And the Safecity app actually acts as the tool that brings the evidence about that then they can look at. And so the methodology is that the Safecity team goes in and says, let's talk about what's going on in your community, and using the tool in different ways to bring out different evidence. And so using that methodology, not only are we able to do that intervention in a particular community, but communities that are adjacent to one another can begin to share how that data is being used across communities, and they can use the data themselves. And so what the tool is doing is it's giving us a way to use, to bring the evidence to the forefront in such a way that is community sensitive, that looks at the laws and issues in different communities and doesn't try to lump things together. And so with that ethical mandate in terms of how the app is used and the community, their communicative research methodology, we're able to go in and develop evidence that is community specific, but because it's anonymous, it can be used across the world.
Thanks, Andrea. It was very interesting for me as well, because we are practitioners on the ground, whereas, when you put theory and match it to the practice, I find it really fascinating. Usually it's the other way around that people go about doing things like that. But yeah, it's been an interesting collaboration with you. And now we turn to Colette, who is the founder of the Lead Impact Institute LLC, which is her latest venture, and a graduate faculty at New York University. Colette, you've been putting together a lot of compendiums on papers regarding data collection, ethics, privacy, community. Can you share a little bit about why this is important at this moment in time?
Sure. Thank you so much, Elsa, first for organizing this beautiful discussion. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to join each of you. It's a pleasure to see you all again and to meet you. My work is really such that I teach in areas that are quite distinct in terms of the way they approach theory. And quite frankly, that theory is closed off to concerns that address racial and gender-based violence. And what I mean by that is theories that are Western, theories that are rooted in realism and liberalism, often do not take into consideration the concerns that we're addressing on this panel. And I consider that to be a sin of omission. A sin of omission which has tremendous implications for the way we live and the way we understand each other. And what I mean by that is, if you talk about peacemaking, you're struggling to understand violence and conflict from inside a particular community. You have to go deep inside of that community to really understand and to hear and to listen to the voices of the people who are speaking to you. And oftentimes theories in international relations ignore those voices completely. They're too focused on conflict that is a byproduct of state to state interrelationships from the last century, and they're not looking ahead. This panel, I think, is very rooted in the present day and the challenges of the present day, in the needs to understand the emerging practice of crowd mapping, which I think from a data perspective is exciting. because it allows for voices to be heard and visualizations to be made that help young students to grapple with the violence that we're experiencing today, the violence of the here and now. And instead of focusing on the past and on theories that have been hashed and rehashed over and over again, what we're actually doing is creating something, being innovative, questioning what we take for granted. And I think that this panel and what has been discussed on this panel takes nothing for granted. And that's what I appreciate in it. You see, to be someone who teaches about theory, you have to be steeped in practice in international relations, because theory in international relations without a sense of practice has little sense. As a matter of fact, it has no sense at all, if you think about it. So in my work, part of what we're trying to do in our learning, in our research, in our service above all, is to look at those themes that are often the elephant in the room, those themes that people are uncomfortable speaking about, those themes that people choose to ignore because they're taken out of their comfort zone. We are very much required in our learning to be outside our comfort zone and to use crowd mapping and to focus on racial and gender-based violence and not simply state-to-state violence, to focus on the violence inside of communities. This is where the reality is. And this is what international relations has to begin to approach. We can no longer be content to simply use the literature as a crutch. What crowd mapping actually does is it takes away the crutch. And it brings us back into the realities of inequity. It brings us back to the realities of patriarchy and privilege. It brings us deep into, comparatively speaking, the community concerns that are most evident in different parts of the world today. And in the time of this pandemic, that reality is one that we must explore because our world is much more fragile. Our world is truly a cobweb, to use Burton's term, and its fragility is real. Crowd mapping exposes that fragility, and it exposes it in these fundamental contexts: racial violence, gender-based violence. That is where our attention has to be focused. And in the academic world, if we truly want to be relevant, if we truly want to make a difference in society, then our focus must be on these particular concerns. We cannot afford to ignore what is staring us right in the face. So this is why I appreciate working with Elsa and working with the Red Dot Foundation, and especially writing with Andrea. We've been doing a lot of writing, and it's always a pleasure to write with Andrea because it's creative. It's creative. We question things that need to be questioned. We are collaborators in the true sense of the word. And I think this is all made possible because of the practice of crowd mapping. This is what makes our research possible. It's what makes our inquiries come alive. So I think I'll pause there, Elsa, because I know there's a lot to be discussed, but I think I'll close by saying that more and more our identity, and conflict today is identity-driven conflict. More and more our identity is very, very much intertwined with our digital lives. So talking about personal data and talking about identity, those two things go hand in hand. You cannot divorce them. And I think because so much of conflict is identity driven, there is an imperative to look at data from the standpoint of identity and how our identity is multifaceted, how we are nomads. Migration is the major challenge in our world today. We are migrating as people, but we are also digital nomads, and our identity is profoundly affected by this. This is a whole area of international relations that has yet to be explored. There are books that have to be written about this because there's nothing in the literature that exists. our responsibility is to create that literature, to define identity-driven context by bringing in crowd mapping in the racial and gender environments. Thank you.
Thanks, Colette. I think you framed it really well. And ultimately, we are talking about people, and these are people's stories. In my view, crowd mapping is just a tool where we give a space for someone to share their deeply personal traumatic experience, and by doing so anonymously. And we'll talk a little bit more about the anonymous part. But why is it important? Because in my view, it helps them in their healing process. But two, like I said before, it makes visible the invisible. And Jane, I learned so much from Jane and how she, goes about her work. And she mentioned talking boxes earlier. So talking boxes are boxes that she had placed in schools where girls would place their notes in it, and she would analyze those notes. When she came to me, we just helped her digitize those notes. So she was always doing it. But then there's cross-learning, right? She used my platform to digitize her notes, and we use her idea of talking boxes in rural communities. And they are equally powerful in India too, where, as you know, digital access, digital literacy is a challenge. But it's very important to collect this data because it has to be told. You have to give space for that experience. And maybe I'm going to turn it over to Jane to explain some of the interventions that she and her team have worked on, which I think are extremely innovative, but they've been data-driven and evidence-based data-driven.
Thanks so much, Elsa. One intervention that we had that was very effective, we had the children from school complaining about this particular space where men would harass them, where there were men who would just sit there and try to touch them when they are passing, make comments on them. So most of them would take longer routes going home because they were scared of these men. And this was when they mentioned this space, what we did is that we reached out to a local radio station, and we got one boy as well to go to that space and get them to be key listeners when the program is going on the radio, the local radio station. And that place was mentioned. It was mentioned several times, and then the boys were like, "Hey, this is our space. How is it mentioned?" And they now started the conversation among themselves, asking, "You know what, this is what we do, and these young girls are passing, and maybe we should stop." So these boys actually later now, instead of being perpetrators of sexual harassment, they became the champions who would now talk to other boys about not harassing girls when they are going to school. And another thing is that when we got the pamphlet from Red Dot Foundation, then we were like, we were trying to look at all those types of sexual harassment if they are really in our context. And when I had a session with the girls, I was like, do we really have indecent exposure in our context? Because in our context, people talk of rights where you can put on what you want. And then we got the children telling us that, you know what, when we are passing in such places, we have these notorious people every now and then. When we are passing, that is the time that they are pretending to be urinating, meaning they are trying to expose themselves to us. And now it got people talking. It was like, hey, teachers, this is what happens out there. There are these areas where there are men who are trying to expose their private parts to the girls. And so many interventions were done with that. So with that one, in fact, this particular space that we were talking about was next to a mosque. So they would call it Karibu na Mosque Ndogo, meaning near the small mosque. So we got the imam of the mosque to actually own up and talk to the boys about it, just announce using the big public address that, you know what, we don't want our mosque to be demonized because of this. Can you guys just stop doing this? So we have also engaged the young women. I'm happy that I'm seeing one of them who is from not a very near area. Her name is Aflin Yogo. I'm seeing her online. Thanks, Aflin, for joining. We have been able to engage these young women now to, we give the young girls the notebooks. So they collect cases that they experiences on sexual harassment, and they put them And then when the bigger girls go in, they take the data, and then the data is keyed in the computer. So we've been able to engage so many other people into the conversation. And we've just taken this as an innovation that we talk about every now and then wherever we are. I know we have been having our digital challenges, and most of our data are not keyed in. But moving forward, this is what we are going to do, just get as much data as possible on sexual harassment. Thanks.
Thank you,
Elsa.
Jane. And I want to acknowledge you just received a UNFPA award. So congratulations to you and your team for this important work that you're doing. And I really love the idea of engaging religious leaders. So if you caught that, there was a hotspot near a mosque, and she brought in the imam and he started preaching in his sermons. You know, often when we think of violence against women and girls, we think of policing, but police is only one response. There are so many other creative ways that you can talk about it or find community support. Also, community support is critical because it is not your responsibility alone. It should never be your responsibility alone. But we often find, especially in India, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, when you tell your story, others are quick to put the blame on you, saying you were in the wrong place, you were wearing the wrong outfit, you were there at the wrong time, and so on and so forth. But when you can show through the data, and on our crowd map, we have such data trends that 10 women were grouped, 10 women were exposed to somebody masturbating in a public space, then it makes you pause and wonder, why is it happening and what can be done and what is the role of bystanders. But now I want to turn to Monica and ask her, recently we heard that there was a spate of violent incidents against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Can you share a little bit about that and maybe a little bit about your research around it? But I think your organization also works with all the helplines across the country, right? So can you share a little bit about, some of the insights that are coming up from that work?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question because it's really at the top of my mind right now. There's always been violence, against the AAPI community. When 9/11 happened, even before, 9/11, it's something that our communities have lived with. But this last year, with the rise in COVID, hate crimes against Asians increased. Additionally, the Atlanta spa shootings, really put it on the map of, what was happening in our communities. It was a very interesting and sad moment for me because I'm in Atlanta. I live and work in Atlanta, and I had just started my new role the day before the Atlanta shootings happened. So nationally, I was hearing the reaction, but I was also locally hearing the reaction of what was happening when the shooting was 4 miles away from my home. And knowing the reaction of law enforcement, hearing some of what said really tore us up because, we knew that a lot more education had to be, done here in Atlanta, because immediately the sheriff said this is not, a racially motivated crime. And we were like, well, how can it not be? And, we're really trying to push the conversation that racism, is rooted in gender-based violence. You can't, have one conversation without, really talking about the other. There's intersectionality there. And so that is really where we want to put a lot of more effort and research in, because the Atlanta shooting showed that there's still a disconnect, when just because the shooter doesn't say I was motivated by hate doesn't not make it a hate crime when everyone, every place he visited was Asian owned and known to have, Asian workers. And so there has to be a connection. And, just because it wasn't right, outright said, and it never will be, right? Why didn't we describe it that way? And so it really showed us in the AAPI community that this level of, education needed to happen. We've heard because of COVID, the increase in AAPI violence. There are elderly women who are afraid to go out at night. People on my staff who live in Oakland, California, who will not, go out of their homes after 7 p.m. because they're afraid of any violence that can happen towards them. And so the reports that have come in have shown that there has been a 70% increase in AAPI violence that's been documented, and a majority of that is against women. So that is something that we need to really take into consideration when we're, working on messaging. We recently received funding from the federal government to develop messaging in a way that hits those communities in a language, like in an accessible language way, and in doing it in a way through modes that the community communicates in. So, just maybe having big billboards is not enough. Maybe we need to go through WhatsApp and WeChat. Those are the social media, communicators that our population, really rely on. And we need to have some communications for assistance, what to do if you see something, because it's also, in all my years, I was born and raised in the United States, and my parents came when they were 18 years old in the 1950s. And I have never seen the AAPI voice louder and, saying what's going on in our community than it is now. We've always been known to be the silent minority, which just puts our head down and works hard and tries not to report anything. But with this new resurgence of voices and louder voices, we want to make sure that we have the tools and the capacity to make sure that we do support that as well. So that is where our work is leaning towards next.
Thanks, Monica. I really feel that we need to hear more from the ground, and in a way, it creates pressure bottom up. I want to turn to Suzanne. As a criminologist and sociologist, you know that crime has a pattern, and we've seen that in our data, right? Also, Monica spoke about bystanders in a way, if we stay silent, how are we going to put pressure on the system to react? So can you share a little bit about some of the, we wrote a paper on women's reaction in buses, but also to the point that crime has a pattern to it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things about crowd mapping, and in particular, the work we've done with Vanya Sakato out of Stockholm. She's really done the most of anyone that I've seen to put place as a unit of analysis on the map, so to speak, pun intended, as another unit of analysis for understanding crime. And particularly here in the US, and I think probably the Western context more generally, but Europe has moved forward. We've moved in another direction. We tend to, one of our biggest problems is we think of almost everything here individualistically, and we miss so much, right? It's not just about, and we're so punitive, and we focus on, the getting of the offender. And, we had, I discovered, I have a child now in middle school, but, I have neighbors and people in the community with kids in middle school. And I found out, this was probably about 2 years ago, maybe 3, I lose track of time with the pandemic, but the young people at the school were having something they were calling Slap Your Ass Day. I called the school up to talk about, hey, could we maybe do some educating, or, this sounds like it's a thing. Oh, well, no, we have a health studies department. We have it under control. We're dealing with the offenders. Offenders? These are middle school kids. What do you mean offender? They don't even understand the implication probably of what they're doing, the broader context, gender. They don't understand any of that. And so instead of having a conversation and making that a teaching moment, because, we are in a school, they reacted with this, punitive type of approach. And that's how we do everything here. And it's not working. And so I like place as a unit of analysis and crowd mapping, because like Colette said, it's like you can see the picture totally differently. You're outside of it. You can create an outside location to look at the broader context, and not just to see things that aren't normally reported, but see them locationally. That's an amazing transformative tool. I put in the, I like analogies. I put in the the comments chat. The term that Colette used was, it's a web, right? And so I made the analogy of like, we're like Wilbur in Charlotte's Web. We're able to, with the crowd map, be outside and look from the outside while we're standing in it. That's revolutionary.
Thanks. I want to give an example also. We did, just before COVID, we went to a school in Bangalore it was a data visualization competition. And they took our Safecity data and they analyzed it. And it was the day that this event was taking place was 14th February, which was Valentine's Day. And on the way from the airport to the school, my colleague told me, there is a peak just around this day. And I was like dismissive about it, saying that maybe, I don't know why it is there, but maybe, we need to analyze it further. But one of the teams picked that up. There was a peak 1 week before 14th Feb, and there was a peak after 14th of Feb, and they analyzed the peaks. On the college campus, the first peak was called Propose Day. That is before 14th February, which is Valentine's Day. And the next peak coincided with something on college campuses, which is called Breakup Day. And it was a long time before I've been on a college campus, so I was not aware of it. But that's what is pop culture currently. And no wonder this is contributing to the violence. But if we had that information as college campus authorities, maybe we can address it, just like you were saying, slap your ass day. So, and this is coming up in our data. So Andrea, let's talk about the elephant in the room about privacy and data, because I get asked this question all the time about the Safecity data and tools like crowdsource mapping. How can they still be useful but protect the identity of people?
So great question. So I can talk a little bit about how we do it. But first of all, the data that comes in is anonymous data, and we don't get any identified data in the data that is collected. So if individuals are talking about their stories, that is anonymous data. The data is also aggregated after it is after it comes in anonymously, and so there aren't any identifying attributes to the data. But it's also important to know that we understand the risks associated with people sharing their stories, because they're just detail in stories. And we understand that. And we have actually had individuals contact us and say, hey, should I share this information? And we're very protective of individuals in terms of how they share information. But it's important to know that we go through a specific process to make sure that the data itself is not identifiable in our systems. And that was not just based upon what we were required to do by all of the platform companies. It was an intentional design process that we went through to make sure that we were looking at the vulnerability of the people that were asking to provide us this information, and making sure then that that their information is protected. We also talk to them about the risks of providing the information. One of the most exciting things about the Safecity team and the process is that we go and talk to the individuals that are going to be providing the data. It is not just here's an app, put your information in and we'll see you later. It is a process, working with communities, building trust, really helping individuals understand, here's the data, here's how it's going to be used, and it's your data. We want to protect you and your data in the context of what we're doing. And then that protection, we make sure on the back end that protection exists. We review our policies. We have worked diligently from a privacy perspective to understand the risk associated with that and how that plays out in the future. And it's important to be able to tell individuals that when they're sharing their data, that we understand that they're vulnerable. We understand that it's important to them, and we want them to have comfort in terms of sharing the data with us.
Thanks, Andrea, for sharing and explaining so clearly about this complex topic about ethics and privacy. Colette, you are part of these listening circles, and your work is also on conflict resolution. I wanted to ask you about, as the world and COVID has forced us into this high-tech world. So it's a matter of time when everybody is going to be using tech all the time, right? If we are not already doing it. So as we go along, tools like what we are doing, because when I launched Safecity 9 years ago, it was not, didn't understand how it was going to be used. The crowdsourced data set was not an acceptable data set. Today, it is a very sought after data set as an additional layer for decision making. But as we continue, there'll be more innovations and more tools like this. So from your perspective, how can it be used as a peace building tool in communities?
I mean, I think that is the question, Elsa. I mean, you've hit the nail right on the head. And I think first and foremost, rather than speaking of resolution, I would say this context and everything I've listened to today speaks to me of transformation, in the sense that there are existing narratives, which I think are, again, rooted in structures that are somewhat outdated, in institutions that no longer respond to the needs that we have. Therefore, I think as more and more people come online, and as more and more people become comfortable using these tools in their own local environments, it becomes much more incumbent on us to be sensitive to the different ways in which these tools can be used. And it's a learning experience for all of us, because the way that I might be inclined to use a specific tool might go against the norms in another society. And as more and more people come online, there's going to have to be more and more discussions and more listening about how these tools are used in order for us really to dialogue in a productive way. I think ethically, what we are doing at the grassroots, and you're right, I mean, these stories are really the way in which we hear from the grassroots about the experiences in daily living, that are experiences that speak to empowerment, because people who are speaking out refuse to be victimized. And I think that when we think about data today, and we think about the tremendous misuses of data by companies, by firms, without the awareness of the people involved, I think we're a check on that, because we are extremely sensitive to the way in which people who share their data are trusting us and are willing to collaborate with us because they know that we are sensitive to their vulnerabilities. This is in direct contradistinction to what you see major firms doing. And it certainly speaks against the uses through social media of data to misinform. And I think this is one of the key challenges that we face. So the work that we're doing is squarely situated as a counter to what we see as a much larger trend, unfortunately, and it's a corporate trend. So it's a trend that has to be consistently combated. And I think the more grassroots we are and the deeper we are able to go into the local context, the more effective we are, because we need to be present where these companies want to invade. And I think we are establishing, through crowd mapping as an emerging practice, we are establishing our presence on the ground. It's not enough, I think, to say that we have these global conversations, because in my mind, global conversations too often are divorced from local needs. And I think when we speak of the cobweb, and I deliberately brought up Burton's, this is his wording, cobweb. The cobweb is the fragile nature of our ecosystem. We're no longer simply in an international system, we're in an ecosystem. Everything about climate change, everything about pandemic, everything about racial and gender-based violence in that environment speaks to eco, not ego. Ego is realism. Ego is Western. Ego is insensitive to the local context. Eco is present in the local context where we are. We are, as crowd mappers, part of that emerging ecosystem. And this, Andrea and I were discussing this. This is the alternative third image to Walz's international system. The ecosystem is the alternative. Waltz is writing in 59. We're writing 2019 and beyond. We're looking ahead. We're saying eco, not ego, because eco is where it's at. Eco is where the women's voices are being heard. Eco is where the racial injustice has to be brought out. Eco is where we make the invisible visible. The international would keep that all invisible because the international couldn't care less. The international only wants to know about military establishments. Well, that's one source of conflict. But if you want to talk transformation, and that's what we're doing, you are talking about violence that is of a fundamentally different nature. We are talking about the violence that is inside. We are talking about the violence that targets identity, whether it's gender, whether it's racial, whether it's trans, whether it's non-human species. And that's the other thing about the eco. The eco is not only about us as humans, it is about other species. And I think we need to be expanding our thinking in this way. And that's why I'm very happy that we brought up the religious leaders. And I think Jane is right on point. We need to have more of this thinking in terms of how do religious leaders come into our dialogue. Also, how do correctional facilities officers, to speak back to Suzanne, how do they come in to this dialogue? Because they are addressing a lot of concerns in prisons with racial violence and with gender violence that I think we need to be more aware of. And we certainly need to crowd map. So I'll leave it there, but that in short would be my initial response.
Thank you so much. There's so many wise nuggets over there. But at this point, I want to turn to our audience. We are a small group, so please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question to any of our panelists or myself. Or maybe you want to quote something that you're doing in your work that is interesting for us to hear and learn from as well. I see Monica Carco is here, and she currently is heading the Women G20 on behalf of her government in Italy. Hi, Monica. I also see Judge Roshan Dalvi. She's a Rotary Peace Fellow, but she was also, a judge in India. She just retired as a judge in India. Hi, Roshan.
Hello.
Would you like to weigh in on any of your experiences?
My experiences are essentially legal. So when I was just thinking that when we are doing all this mapping, and this could be used for our court systems also, and especially for sexual harassment, we have various committees and we are on certain committees, etc. So even for that, maybe it could be used because we sort of not only have deterrent punishments, but we also try to mediate and to see how mindsets can change, or a particular instance can be sort of, made better in a given situation, especially for sexual harassment. So that could be, I was just thinking whether it could be collated, together, like someone said that, like you said that at some platform, you digitized and now you're using herb boxes or whatever that is. That's a nice idea. So similarly, I think it could be used even for legal work, and we'll have to give it a thought because it's a different way of
Yeah. I think, I like to think of it as preventive and restorative justice rather than punitive all the time, because
correct, absolutely.
if you're talking about 95% of women being sexually assaulted at least once in their lifetime, and those are pretty much the numbers of the women I know, then you'll have so many people in prison. And that's not what we want. We want a reformed society.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So,
And that is why we
you're
have
right,
this
yeah.
preventive restorative justice system for things like sexual harassment. We can't have it for crimes which are committed, because they are committed and the state takes action. But you see, we don't know what happens in offices. We don't know, just as you say about public spaces. So it could be extended to that perhaps.
Thank you for sharing. Thanks. I see Tracy Lucas has a hand up.
Hello, everybody. I'm a student of Professor Leah's. In our class, we were doing the mapping and talking about Safecity. And I enjoyed hearing all the information as to what's going on globally with it and how you all are trying to get a handle of how to get the data so that it can be acknowledged. And I just wanted to speak from, here in the district. We're trying to introduce and incorporate that into our communities. And I think, the main thing is engaging our youth because they experience a lot here. And I think it's a matter of gaining trust with them so that they know that what happens to them matter. And I think if we can get past that point, then we can get them to engage in giving the data and the information so that we can, as you say, gather it and let people who are the powers to be know that, hey, look, this is a problem. And so I'm hoping that somewhere in now and later that I can become a part of the process of engaging the youth and meeting the youth where they are, to let them know that this is a process that can work in their benefit. So thank you for having me today. And I have taken away a lot from this process.
Thank you, Tracy. And I remember when I came before the pandemic, I think I met you. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Jane, would you like to share a little bit about your process and how you build trust in your community before you begin the talk about and mapping and collecting of the data on sexual violence?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elsa. So as we have different strategies, and I'm happy that one of our speakers has talked about engaging the law enforcers. So we have something that we call we have assemblies and academies. So assemblies, we have something we call the stakeholders, the administration assembly. So we support the administration to hold their meeting, like the departmental meetings. They are expected by the government to have quarterly meetings with their departmental heads, but they don't really have funds. So what we do is that we book for them a space and we organize food and everything for them. We don't really give them any money for transport or something like that. But with that, now we are able to push our agenda into their conversation. Now, we don't attend their meeting, like we're just there listening, and we request them to give us just 1 hour to talk to them about meaningful engagement, about the opportunities they have and the rest. Another thing is that we go into organized groups and organized institutions. When we talk about a school is there with or without us. So we are only adding value to them. And in communities, most women are organized. People are organized for different reasons. We have women who are just organized for things as simple as funerals. Women who are organized for, we call it merry-go-round, like maybe because they are low-income earners, they're able to put money together and give to somebody else. Next time they give to the other person, another time they give to the other person. In fact, mostly women are known to be very, very organized. And now these organized groups is when we maybe get one of them as part of us, and that is how we go into their spaces. And another thing, when we hear about opportunities out there, because we have so many organizations with opportunities, yet they really don't know how to mobilize people, then we take advantage of that and take them in so that they're also able to learn. You know, most organizations from outside, when they come into communities, they're able to give transport reimbursement. So there are people who can go there because of poverty, because they need that little money. And in that process, we are able to win them and have our conversations with them. So definitely that is what we, how we reach out to them. And we try as much as possible to help them to understand that these are their initiatives. We are only creating platforms for them to make their lives better. So at the end of the day, they really trust us. And another thing is that we use them through their children. We have been able to win the hearts of so many children. Like during COVID, many organizations closed their offices as we couldn't close. I tried to close the office and we were only closed for a weekend. When they didn't find us in the office, they came to our homes. So at the end of the day, we opened the office, and that was the only safe space that they had. And with that, nobody can convince a child that our organization has issues, because it's their organization. And with that, the schools, you know, they can't turn us away. They must just work with us. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, for sharing. And you also use sport to build the confidence of women, right?
Yes,
you
we
want to
use
share a little
sports.
bit about that?
In fact, we use sports to promote peace and cohesion among especially the women. Kibera is a very divided, or Kenya is so much divided along tribal lines. We have more than 42 tribes, but we have a few major tribes which are always in conflict, especially towards elections. Like we're having our elections next year, already there are so many divisions. So we use sports to create those platforms where people can meet together and just play and just talk about the things that unite them and not the things that separate them. We know that there are things like politics really separate people. What again separates people? Religion, you know, religion also really separates. In fact, Kenya is a very religious country. Anytime we're having meetings, then you will hear people talking about, can a Christian pray for us to begin? Can a Muslim pray for us to end? We don't do that. What we say is that we observe a minute of silence for each person to just connect with whoever they want to connect with, their maker, you know. So we respect the spiritual aspect of everybody, but we don't push people to align, because we believe that the moment you're telling people, you know, let Christians pray for us, let Muslims pray for us, then you're already creating divisions. And then we also, like for children, what we do is that it is thematic sports. When we are having sports, then we pick, like now we are talking about menstrual hygiene, we are talking about violence against girls, we are talking about the sexual harassment, and now the theme comes out very openly where they are playing. And the playground is an open, a safe space where they can talk about anything, you know, when they are in that space all alone before the games that attract more people, then they can talk about their issues without getting scared.
Thank you for sharing. And I was witness to a volleyball game in Kibera.
Yes, I know. We took you to the field. Yes, and you know, people play barefooted. We don't really have, you know, people don't have shoes and things like that. We are as natural as we are. Yeah,
And,
thank you so much.
and that's
Elsa.
fine. That's absolutely fine. I wanted to ask Monica about building trust, because you worked with immigrants at a time when it was really difficult for them. So how do you build trust in the system and trust, you know, with even the organization that they're working in a highly toxic environment?
Yeah. I think, you know, the one concept that I always go back to in trust, it takes a long time to build trust. It takes moments to break trust, right? And so, you know, keeping that in mind and being really authentic and focused in, you know, the good that you can create through trust is something that is my North Star that leads me every single day. And so, you know, I think for me, you know, when I've worked with immigrant clients, there's so much distrust of everything. Many of my clients had come from crisis situations. They're in current crisis situations. They come from countries where law enforcement is not to be trusted. And then seeing what's happening, in front of their eyes in the media makes them question what our law enforcement is doing as well. So you really have to have a united front, and partnerships and collaborations, I believe, are really important. I do not overpromise. If there is something that I do not know, I say I do not know. And I will do my best to find out, the information, because I think giving false information, really can hurt, in the long run. It can hurt the client, it can hurt the community, because people share, right, what they've learned and what they know. And so you really want to make sure that you're building good information, and then partnering, with organizations that do the work where you don't do the work. So as an organization, you don't have to be one organization that does everything for everybody. It really is actually, your expertise, you live in your expertise, but partner with folks who have other expertise. So if I, for example, we provide immigration legal services, I don't provide housing services. So for me to go into that would be, probably not, it would be very disingenuous. And so I partner with, organizations, and we build trust in the community that way. And then collectively, you want to build trust with systems. We do a lot of educating with systems, the law enforcement system, which is right now really at the focal point of many communities, many survivors not wanting to go, but then there are some who do want to go. And it really is, specific to that survivor's experience. So I think listening to the survivor and making sure that you address their concerns and not tell them what their concerns are is the first step, I believe.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to turn to our audience again. Do you have any questions? Last round. Okay, so with that, my takeaways from the session have been that data matters. Crowdsourcing tools like the one we talked about at Safecity gives voice to everyone, and also a negotiating tool to bring in unlikely stakeholders like religious leaders, because you have evidence to prove your point. But we can be mindful about data privacy, security, ethics, about data collection. And also, we can use it as a peace building tool. But since we are in the last 16 days of activism, and this is a tough topic, I want to touch upon self-care. So I'm going to ask Colette to kick us off. How do you take care of yourself, Colette?
That's a wonderful question. I swim each day. I go to a nearby pool, and I spend about 2 hours in the water, and I do all types of exercises. I walk in the water, and then I come back and I prepare my favorite dish. I light a candle, I listen to music, and I think about all the wonderful friends I have around the world, and I smile. And that's my way of self-care. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette. What about you, Andrea?
So I've been having some self-care challenges recently, but one of the biggest things that I do is play with my 80-pound boxer, who loves me up and licks me and makes me feel wonderful all the time. And I just wanted to share a quote, and I'm not going to remember the guy's name that made it, but I will drop it in the chat if I can find it before we're done. And he said that our very lives depend on the ethics of strangers. That the fact that we can, people stop at the stoplight and they open the door and hold it for you or whatever, our very lives are depending upon that. And so as an ethicist, I just encourage people to just be ethical in how you treat others. I think it's a critical part of what we do every day.
Thank you for that. And actually, Monica spoke about collaboration. We cannot solve any of this alone. So we have to depend on each other and collaborate with each other. And we don't have to necessarily be good at everything, but we can be good at one thing and still partner with each other. Suzanne, what about you? How do you take care of yourself?
Well, I've been also having challenges akin to my dear friend there, Andrea. But actually, I think you almost kind of explained it. I have to think I agree, Jillian. That blew my mind. We depend on the kindness of strangers, and I think that's true. And maybe that's why, we've got this pandemic situation in this country, and we've really well illustrated here how just corrosive it is for people not to come together. And I think that's why, because, at an innate level, we understand that we live in a web and we do depend on one another. And right now, a lot of people feel hostile, and the stranger feels hostile. In fact, most, when you encounter actual people, they're great. Rarely do I encounter anyone of any range of the spectrum. When you actually talk to them and get past all the politics, that's not a decent human. But you don't know that when they're just going by you and everything feels hard right now. And so I've been struggling with that. I was doing the swimming, actually, like Colette, and walking a lot, which was helping immensely. And then I damaged my Achilles tendon, which was an unfortunate setback. So I am struggling a little bit, but trying to reach out to people, trying to stay engaged, in the work, and be positive. But it's hard, it's just hard.
Thank you for sharing. And, talking about self-care also is quite difficult. So imagine talking about your experiences about sexual and gender-based violence or racial violence. And that's why it's important to normalize these conversations and feel vulnerable, and it's okay to feel vulnerable. Thank you for sharing. Monica, what about you?
What is self-care? I think I need to learn that a little bit better. I'm just joking. I'm really good at lecturing others and my team on caring for themselves, but I don't think I'm a very good role model. And I've been really working on that during the pandemic. And so I go back to, okay, self-care equals joy, right? What brings you joy in your life? And many of us go back to our childhood. What brought us joy in our childhood? And so I try to make time for something, for my, just to connect with my senses. So going outside, feeling the fresh air, smelling the fresh air. If I can take little strides like that don't require me to sign up for something and then not show up and then beat myself up because I didn't show up, I think then I call that a success. So just going outside, breathing the fresh air, lighting a candle, smelling the scent, that makes me happy. But the big thing that I've really tried to do is connect with loved ones a lot more. Being with, whether it's my family, friends from high school, from childhood, college, that I've not been having a chance to connect with, that keeps me grounded.
Thanks, Monica. Finally, Jane.
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Elsa. I want to say that I haven't done so well when it comes to self-care. My son was just telling me the other way that, Mom, you just have to change. I'm trying lately. I'm trying to get into groups where women are, so that we are able to share together and, just be women. I think my adult life, I've always been around work and taking care of my children, Yes, I am a Christian. I go to church, but I don't even belong to those small Christian communities where people are able to talk in depth. And I've always thought of doing that, but I've not been able to do that. But I think I want to make it my priority right now. I always push it to next month. I say, you know what? By June, I don't want a lot of work in the office. I just want to take care of myself. June passes. I say by July, by August, by November. Right now, I'm saying by January, I'm shedding off a lot of work. and just making sure I take good care of myself. I hope it will come to pass.
Thank you, Jane. And it's so
Yeah.
important as leaders, as role models, that we take care of ourselves before we lecture others. And for the work that we do, which is so important, that is violence against women and girls, and creating safe spaces and conflict resolution and peace building, we need to really take care of ourselves. Lots of people are depending on us. So what do? I try to exercise 3 times a day, 3 times a week, not a day, at least 3 times a week, and also incorporate some yoga into my time. And I binge watch Netflix sometimes, and that's really a good distraction. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending this session. I hope you learned a lot, because I certainly did. Even though I know these ladies for a long time, I still learned a lot from their work. And yeah, it's very inspiring. And I hope we can all collaborate with each other and continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa, for organizing the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Indeed,
Camilla,
Elsa.
you can
Let's do this
stop.
again soon.
everyone.
Thank you.
Camilla, you can stop the recording.